Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 26th of November 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. And today we're going to be focusing on events in Yemen. Now, this is considered the war that no one wants to talk about. And it is quite impressive that today David Cameron stood up in the House of Commons and spoke for 20 minutes on action that he is intending to take in Syria, and answered questions from members of Parliament for another 40 minutes or so, giving an hour of his time to that issue, and stays completely silent, it seems, on this one. Now, the vast majority of media focus is on Syria and Ukraine. We get the odd story telling us that bombs have dropped in one location or another, with people being killed or injured in the Yemen. But no sort of backstory, no description of why this is happening or what's going on, and that's really what we want to address today. So joining me, I have Kim Sharif, Director of the organisation Human Rights for Yemen, and I have Vanessa Beeley from the Syria Solidarity Movement. Welcome to you both. Now, Yemen, of course, shares a border with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is really the only is the main antagonist here, I believe. But before we start, I'm going to say that, like many people, I'm pretty ignorant about what's going on there, who's fighting whom, so that's what we hope to sort out today. So if we begin with you, Kim, could we get sort of a brief introduction to events in Yemen, how they've come about, and who is involved in this actually?
That there was an Arab Spring in the Yemen in 2011. That was the result of some 35 years of oppression by the former president Ali Abdullah Saleh. The people rose, and then the people who got up there and dealt with the Arab Spring were a coalition of many of the prominent political parties in the Yemen, which includes the Communist Party, another party called the Hizb al-Haq, the party of right, and Islah Party. Islah Party is the Muslim Brotherhood of the Yemen, and many others. And as you know, the former president was deposed, following which the Gulf Cooperation Council intervened in the affairs of the Yemen and superimposed the Gulf Initiative. The Gulf Initiative's effect was to put the Yemen constitution in abeyance. They then put the then deputy of the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, a man called Abdu Rabbu Mansour, as the caretaker president. Now, his remit was for a period of 2 years to facilitate a general election for the people to choose a new president and a new government and set a new parliament. 2 years, that was in 2011. 2 years later, nothing was done. During the period of the 2 years that Mr. Hadi was in power, he managed to put all of his best friends in a quango who were assisting him with the work. And the quango then somehow, under pressure or some other way, extended his period of caretaking for a further period of a year, which period then expired in 2014. That was February 2014. Come September 2014, nothing was still achieved. And so the very people who were involved in the Arab Spring, majority of them, came back to confront Mr. Hadi on the 21st of September 2014. And the coalition of those parties includes the army, you have to bear in mind, as well as a party known as Ansarullah, who are also euphemistically somehow known in the world media as the Houthis. But Ansarullah does contain people who are non-Houthis. And what basically happened was, when he was confronted by the people who've had enough, because during his caretaking presidency, the 3-year period, the country just got much worse economically, politically, and in many other ways. It was a horriblely tragic situation to be in. And when he was confronted, he panicked and he ran away in women's clothing to the south of the Yemen, to the port of Aden. And there he started gathering a group of so-called resistance, which today we know is a majority of the well-known international terrorist brands like Al-Qaeda, and of course Daesh. And of course, soon after he mobilized that hodgepodge of terrorist organizations, he went to Saudi Arabia, where he's been looked after ever since. Now, the world does not recognize anybody other than this man. And legally, he has no legitimacy whatsoever. As you can see, his caretaking presidency had ended in 2013. It was extended by a further period of a year, which also expired. And by September 2014, the people of the Yemen, the army, all the other parties voted with their own feet by saying, we want to change, and we want the change to happen now. We're not going to wait anymore. And what the Saudis, who have always regarded the Yemen as some sort of a little colony of theirs, did was they then said, well, we are having to restore the legitimate presidents. Now, I ask the question, and I dare anyone in the world from anywhere, to show me a documentary evidence that proves the legitimacy of this man. So, in essence, this war against the Yemen is simply illegal. What then happens is, on or about 26 March this year, Saudi Arabia, in alliance with Egypt, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Emirates, Turkey, Jordan, and many others, altogether about 11 countries, got together and started bombarding the Yemen ruthlessly and menacingly, flattening the country literally to oblivion. And on average, they're killing about 1,000 people per month, because the figures show approximately about 8,000 now. We are entering the 9th month of this horrible war. I'm not exaggerating if I say that they have committed an act of extermination in an area known as Sada, which is the northernmost of Saudi Arabia, on the Yemen, on the border with Saudi Arabia, which is the place of origin of the party of Ansarullah. One thing I need to make very clear is that the people who are defending the country today are not Ansarullah alone. They are assisted by the army. The Yemen did have an army, and still has its army, and they are assisted by all the other major political parties. The only group that appears to be resisting the country and its de facto government is the party known as Al-Islah. Al-Islah is the Brotherhood of the Yemen. Now, brief background about the Islah is that it was set up by a man called Sheikh Abdul Majid Zandani, who, as far as I know, some 15 years ago, was on the most wanted list of the US terror list. He is today being hosted in Saudi Arabia, and his hodgepodge of affiliates and other terror organizations are wreaking havoc in the southern parts of the Yemen, Hadramaut and Aden area, as well as the Taiz area, where the most intense battles take place. And there's another part called Marib, which is where the other heated battles are taking place on a daily basis. In the Marib, you also had the Emirate who brought in their land troops. They brought in Sudanese, they brought in Somalians, they brought in many others to fight there. But they haven't been able to make any significant gains on the ground level. The army has been formidably and competently resisting this attempt to take over Sana'a, which is what they are aiming at. They want to take the Yemen and return it to what it was, which is a colony of the Saudis, or some kind of a slave for the Gulf Cooperation Council mafia.
Okay, well, earlier on today, Vanessa, you gave me this this website which contains this graph, this map, which seems to show the various factions within, or the various groupings within the Yemen. And you also highlighted this map from Stratfor. Now, we're not promoting Stratfor in any way, and for reasons of copyright, we've got to make the point that this is republished with permission from them, but it's republished. Anybody can republish this if they wish to. And really what we're talking about here is the balkanization of this country. And so, I mean, the question is why?
Well, I think it's incredibly important to make the point, as Kim has obviously very eloquently made prior to me, is that what is often also overlooked in reporting on this conflict is that the Ansarullah movement and the Southern Separatist movement were in coalition and were also in favor of a confederal state system where Yemen would be divided once more into north and south, and where the south would be given autonomy over its own internal affairs. Fundamentally, the majority of the Yemeni people were pro this separatist policy in Yemen, which gave each part autonomy, but also unity underneath a federal system. Now, this Yemen being a republic was always going to be a threat to Saudi Arabia, which we know to be an autocratic, despotic, feudal system country, which is not going to enjoy seeing virtually the only democratic country in the region right on its borders. It's certainly not going to like that, and it's not going to accept that spotlight being put onto its own sort of absolutely terrorist, twisted distortion of Islam policies in that region. Hadi, on Saudi Arabian insistence, was pushing for the KSA, the Saudi Arabian six-state system in Yemen, which was to balkanize Yemen, divide it into sectarian states. The bulk of the Shia Zaydi strongholds were going to be put into a central region consisting of Sana, Sada, Amran, and Darma, which would be incorporated into an area which would be called Azal.
And this is the orange section on this map, is that right? Yes.
It's the sorry, I'm just looking at the map. It's the green.
Red, I think.
It's the green section.
Oh, the green section, right? Okay.
It's the green section, which, if you look at it, would basically mean that the main resistance to Saudi colonization and occupation of Yemen would be completely landlocked and under their control, and would also be unable to access any resources. There's no access to the sea, and obviously they're completely surrounded there. So it would be in essence an oppression of those resistant strongholds. It's also important to make the point that Jamal Benomar, who is the UN peace envoy to Yemen, just prior to the Saudi illegal bombing of Yemen, he actually said, and I quote, "When this campaign started, one thing that was significant but went unnoticed is that the Yemenis themselves were close to a deal that would institute power sharing with all sides, including the Houthis." Now, this is consistently ignored by the international community, that Yemen itself, internally as a sovereign nation, was resolving its internal political issues and was resolving them very successfully. But the problem was, it was without Saudi involvement. And that again demonstrates the international community alliance with Saudi's agenda in Yemen.
Is this purely a geopolitical issue, or is it about resources, natural resources? What is your take on that?
I think it's a combination. If we look at the Al Jauf region, which is in the north, which I think in 2011, Ali Abdullah Saleh had to finally admit the oil and gas reserves that are contained within this area that previously had been pretty much concealed to the Yemeni public. We know that for Saudi Arabia, yes, the oil and gas reserves are of huge importance, but there's also a need to control the oil transport, which is the Bab al-Mandeb or the Straits of Hormuz. The Straits of Hormuz, we know, are controlled pretty much by Iran. The Bab al-Mandeb Straits are controlled by Yemen ostensibly, but probably covertly by the international community and by the GCC. Kim will either agree or disagree with me on that. But there's also, I have been told there are also plans to put pipelines from Al Jauf down to the south, down to Hadramaut, to the coastal area there. Now, if we look at the areas where AQAP, Al-Qaeda, Arabic Peninsula, and ISIS are in control, they're very much strategic. They're in Aden, they're in Hadramaut province, they're in Marib, so they're in all the areas where they are attempting to take control of the natural resources, the gas and the oil reserves. If we look at the so-called coalition bombing or attempts at containment of these areas and their supposed ostensible bombing of the ISIS AQAP areas. It's nonsense. They're not attacking AQAP. They're doing exactly what the US and the US coalition has done in Syria. They're actually protecting the IS AQAP operatives in Yemen. They're not bombing. They're bombing the people that are actually fighting AQAP and ISIS in those areas.
So this has many parallels to Syria then?
Yeah, absolutely, totally. I mean, we can run them side by side, and particularly with now the influx of the ISIS fighters from Syria into Yemen, which, by the way, cannot be carried out without full approval from the UK and US control centers in Riyadh, who control every single humanitarian plane that comes into Yemen and either prevent it if it doesn't, adhere to their policies. So there is no way that these various Emirati planes carrying ISIS operatives into Yemen could have landed in Sana'a without the full and complicit approval of the UK and UN and US control centers in Riyadh.
Kim, just before we move on, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, no, I agree entirely with everything that my sister Vanessa has just said. It is entirely accurate and true, and I'm well impressed that she has managed to have all this information. Well done. The truth is, yes, indeed, there's been an expansion and the delivery of ISIS fighters from Syria into the Yemen, like you quite rightly said. But continuing, we have photographs to show the Saudi planes and others dropping weapons and cash to ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters. And yes, the conflict is about resource. But on the face of it, they are trying to tell the world that this is to do with sectarianism within the Yemen about Shia-Sunni conflict. Far from it. Majority of the Yemenis are Shafi'i Sunnis, and they are with the army and Ansarullah. And there are other Sufis who are also with Ansarullah. And therefore, the suggestion that this is an Iran proxy war is absolute nonsense. As I said before, and I say it again, I wish Iran was involved, because at least there will be some proper humanitarian aid work taking place. Unfortunately, they're not involved. They can't be involved. They have their own issues. And so we're left in the Yemen. The Yemenis are left alone, the whole world versus the Yemen. And of course, they're bringing mercenaries from Blackwater, like Vanessa quite rightly said. And
we'll come on to that in a second. We'll come on to that in a second. Yeah. Look, I'd just like to. You sent me some videos, and I'd just like to put this in a bit of context so people understand the scale of what we're talking about here. So, Kim, I'm going to show some of this, and if you could just talk us through this a little bit.
Yeah, this is one of the markets that has recently been destroyed in the Taiz area. And quite often they target civilian and highly civilian populated areas. They targeted all of civilian infrastructure. So, for example, 4,000 schools and educational centers have been destroyed, like you can see in the picture there, like that market, and much worse. There are about 30,000 people injured. There are some 15,000 of those injuries are most serious and irreparable. There are about 8,000 people dead so far, mostly civilians, women and children, and elderly people who can't fend for themselves or run away or do anything. And you will see hospitals have been targeted. You will see that government centers have been targeted. Nothing has been left out. Even the port of Hodeidah, which was the only port that was accessible to the Yemen from the world, was also targeted a couple of months ago, leading to hundreds and thousands of deaths. They have targeted wedding parties in the Makha area. They've targeted the workers of a local power station in the area of Makha port. That was clearly an act of genocide and war crimes. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Oxfam have all reported about these war crimes and crimes against humanity that have taken place, particularly in relation to Hodeidah and Taiz and the wedding parties. And so the daily carnage continues non-stop. What you see in the picture is just on average what happens everywhere in the Yemen every day.
Okay, well, let's have a look at some of what's going on, because this is a typical video of one bombing, and we've got this going on night and day, it seems, and we've also got the use of unusual weapons which we might say are considered illegal under international law. Is that a fair statement, Kim?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. As you can see from the evidence, you don't have to be a weapons expert to see that is cluster bomb, and that gets used and used repeatedly around the Sana'a area and the Saada area. This was on or around May time, but the process continued non-stop. They are definitely using prohibited weapons, and that's very clear from the photographs. In addition, they also used other chemical weapons which caused horrific injuries. And of course, we can't show those photographs because they are just too distressing to look at.
Right. So, and what we've got here is a video showing a cluster bomb being dropped, and in fact, we see some of the evidence for that here.
This was in Saada. This was in the Saada area, and the same thing happened in the Sana'a area, and it continues to happen. In fact, we've just been told earlier today around Fajr time. Fajr time is around 4 o'clock in the morning. They hit Mount Atan. Mount Atan is in Sana'a, and it appears to be one of their favorite mountains for targeting or for using for nuclear weapons and prohibited weapons.
Well, indeed, we have some video of that here, and I mean this. I can't say that I know 100% what this is, but frankly, the heat and the intensity and the energy in this does seem to demonstrate that it's some kind of low-yield tactical nuclear weapon. I could be wrong about that, and if anybody has any additional information they can give, please pass it along. But the heat within the cloud of that seems pretty incredible. Vanessa, you had some comments about this.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just come in here, the report, it's certainly not a conclusive report yet, but certainly looking at some of the evidence that has been passed over to me, the levels of radioactivity within the crater post this explosion were high. The effects of the blast were felt, I think, up to a 9-kilometer distance away. There are some videos of the actual nature of the blast, which shows that very sort of clear, almost like a ripple effect in the atmosphere from the bomb. But the most damning evidence, as far as I'm concerned, is some of the medical reports that are coming out post this explosion of very classical radiation, sickness, hair falling out, diarrhea, children suffering skin lesions. So it's looking very suspect. Certainly, I'm not going to sit here and say it's definitely a nuclear explosion, but it's certainly looking very, very suspect. I mean, and this should, neither should this distract from the very real, hideous other weaponry that is being used. I mean, the cluster bombs, the bunker bombs, the 1-ton bombs, the white phosphorus, the images that we're seeing of hideous flesh sort of melting chemical weapons that are being seen in the last couple of months. I mean, what this very much reminds me of is Israel and Gaza. You know, we're seeing a very mirror image here in the sense that Yemen essentially is a country under an illegal blockade. Nothing can get into Yemen. They import 90% of their food and are not receiving anything. This is an illegal blockade, exactly the same as Israel's blockade on Gaza. And in exactly the same way, you know, we look at the reports on weapons supplies from both the UK and the US into Saudi Arabia, and we are seeing the Yemeni people being used as experimental victims for any new warfare weapons or armaments that are being developed between the US, the UK, and the Gulf states. In exactly the same way as we see Israel using those experimental weapons on the sort of concentration camp of Gaza. It's absolutely, I mean, it's just heinous, it's disgusting, it's abhorrent. This is a wholesale slaughter of human beings on a vast scale to further geopolitical, resource and economical aims in the region.
Okay, well, look, I am going to give a warning now, because I'm going to show a couple of the images that Kim has given me. Now, Kim, as you said, some of the images that you've given me, I felt were a bit too strong for broadcast. They're available on the internet, of course, if somebody wants to look at those. But if anybody would prefer to look away, now is the time. Can you give us any background to what has happened to this gentleman?
Well, it's as a result of the bombing of the Atan area very recently, and the Sada area. And the result was, as you can see, most shocking and distressing to look at. This is just one of the rare pictures that we managed to get hold of this young gentleman. There are many more. For example, there is a young man called Abdullah Sanban. He was in the wedding party in the Makha area that was attacked, that led to the deaths of nearly 130 people and many injuries. Now, Abdullah is a very interesting young boy. He won a NASA award for young inventor, and in 2012, there is even a photograph of him with NASA representatives being handed the award. This was for inventing a solar-powered vehicle as a young boy. And so that boy was in that wedding, and he was severely injured. His injuries are too bad to show, and I didn't send you his photo for that reason. But I have it if anyone wants to see it. It's available. The boy has been taken out of the country and is being looked after elsewhere right now. But his injuries were as grotesque as the injuries of this other young man you're just looking at. And of course, we can't get hold of all the materials that we require to show from all areas of the Yemen. But the suggestion is that this young man was in the Sana'a area who got affected by this, although it could well be from the Sada area, because Sada is the area that receives most of the horrific and wanton and nasty hysterical attacks routinely.
Of course, people are routinely trapped under falling rubble and falling buildings. Vanessa, where are the white helmets here? Where's the so-called humanitarian solution to helping these people? It's really being left up to the general public, is it, to sort out this problem in Yemen?
Well, I mean, it has to be made very clear that Saudi has been targeting, again, very similar to Israel and actually very similar to the US coalition in Syria, it's been targeting the Yemeni infrastructure. So it's been hitting hospitals, schools, shopping areas, farms, agricultural land, electricity centers. Most of Yemeni's water is underground, so they require fuel and equipment to get that water out. So, very quickly with the blockade and with the targeting of the infrastructure, they're reducing Yemen's own ability to deal with this crisis, which is not of their own making. Added to which, we're seeing US aid, which has a monopoly over the humanitarian relief agencies in Yemen. And we know that US aid is a known operative for CIA and for the US. It withdrew its aid in June 2015 on the basis that the difficulties in Yemen rendered it impossible to implement those aids, which is disgusting. It's turning off the tap on a country that they have made entirely dependent upon their aid at a time that they need it most. So this, to me, only indicates the US complicity in the Saudi wholesale slaughter of Yemeni civilians. Another thing that came out actually quite recently as well, and if we look at the potential depopulation of Syria, for example, under the current conflict, where we're seeing the facilitation of the refugees leaving Syria and entering Europe. We also saw this quite recently, and I don't think it's been reported in the media, and it would be interesting if Kim can confirm this to me. But Ansarullah actually intervened over US aid NGOs attempting to get people out of Yemen via Hodeidah and Mocha. Thousands of Yemenis were being encouraged to flee from Yemen to obviously Djibouti. And this was actually prevented by Ansarullah. Ansarullah, to me, have been incredibly wise throughout this conflict. They've actually seen very quickly the machinations of the Saudi coalition and the US and UK backers, and they've stepped in very prudently to prevent a lot of the actions that they're doing to undermine the Yemeni resistance. And this, in my opinion, was one of them. It was to try to create a feeling of fear and necessity to live. Of course, there is fear in Yemen, but actually what is really thwarting the Saudi plans is the Yemeni resilience and resistance and determination to not kneel before the Saudi coalition and to resist their attempts to occupy and colonize their country. They're not going to accept another Saudi puppet government, never. And so therefore, all of these attempts by the US, the UK, the Saudi coalition are failing, not because it is not an asymmetric conflict. It is. You know, Yemen is facing huge oppression here, and it's facing it with archaic weaponry, with very little logistical support. They're starving. There is only one hospital now in Sana'a, nowhere else in the country that can deal with critical injuries and really dire cases of wounded. But they're still resisting. And this, again, we're going to see a parallel with Syria in the sense that as Syria's resistance was commensurate against interventionism, so is Yemen's. And we will see an increase in both the NGO power complex attempts to undermine Yemeni resistance, as well as military attempts by the coalition to undermine that resistance.
Right. Well, I regret to say we've just lost Kim. So we'll go on ahead with this. We're more or less out of time anyway, Vanessa. But I've got a few more things I'd like to discuss with you. This support that you're talking about from the West is pretty incredible. The UK, as was reported a few weeks ago by The Independent, helped Saudi Arabia get its UN human rights role. And I mean, this to the whole world was the most ridiculous situation that this country, with its reputation, should take charge of United Nations human rights. But equally obscene, really, is this that the UN will not step in here, and Saudi Arabia, in fact, is going to inspect its own war crimes record in the Yemen. This is a pretty spectacular state of affairs, isn't it? Where you can go and bomb a population to bits, kill lots of people, and then inspect your own performance and come out with a clean bill of health, no doubt.
Yeah, I mean, that this has to be made very clear. I mean, it's abject hypocrisy on behalf of the UK government. If we look at the UK and US arms supply, there's a recent US Defense Security Corporation Agency document which was released stating that 1.29 billion in air-to-ground munitions was about to be supplied. A contract was about to be signed with Saudi Arabia. And I quote, the purchases replenishes the Royal Saudi Air Force's current weapon supplies, which are becoming depleted due to the high operational tempo in multiple counter-terrorism operations. I mean, does anybody appreciate how insane this statement is?
Yeah.
You know, once again, we're projecting onto those that are actually resisting terror activity from our own governments and calling them terrorists. I mean, you know, this really has to stop. The UK itself disgustingly describes KSA as a priority market. So we're not only involving them on a military front, and by the way, we're the largest exporter to Saudi Arabia, 36% of their imports on munitions and armaments. But we're even being encouraged in the UK by government departments to actively, even aggressively, go into alliance and into business with the Saudis in health, justice, defense, security sectors. You know, this is an appalling, this has to be protested, that our own government in the UK is basically entangling itself with a nation which is perpetrating terror acts worldwide, globally, universally, not only in Yemen, but we know that Saudi Arabia is behind the Wahhabi terrorist proxy army in Syria. We know they were behind it in Libya. We know they were behind it pretty much, as I say, globally. And yet our UK government is pushing and almost demanding that our UK businesses associate with this country.
Indeed. Now, as I say, we're just about out of time. But I just wanted to get this one in because this is pretty important as well. Because of course it's not just Saudi, United Arab Emirates involved as well. And what the New York Times here is reporting is that they are sending Colombian mercenaries in to fight in Yemen, not just Colombians, Panamanians, Salvadorians, Chileans as well, 450 Latin American troops. And you're suggesting that these are being supplied by Academy, which is the more recent version of Blackwater. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, basically, we know even from my White Helmet investigations that Blackwater was an outsourcing for the CIA to carry out assassinations on their behalf without any guilt being associated with the White House. John Kerry, in fact, was in the UAE, which we know, again, is being presented as this democratic nation, which is sort of a joke. I mean, it's a monarchic, theocratic state. John Kerry himself applauded the UAE for its work in the region. Again, you know, this is his work doing what? Wholesale slaughtering of innocent civilians. You know, I mean, this has to stop. The hypocrisy of our government supporting and aiding and even presenting these countries as democratic beacons in a region where actually the democratic beacon is the one that is fighting this terror invasion of its own sovereign nation. So yes, we are seeing wholesale hypocrisy from Western governments, which is resulting in wholesale massacre of Yemeni civilians.
Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much for that. We're going to end it there for today. Now, clearly, this is a subject that we're going to come back to because it is, you know, obviously fits into the overall situation in the Middle East and people, as we say, losing their lives at an incredible rate. It has to be stopped. So we will come back to this, and hopefully we'll have Kim on again in the not too distant future. So I want to thank Vanessa Beeley and Kim Sharif for joining us today, and thank you all for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.